I'm Hale Champion. I'm standing in for Charles Royer, the usual moderator for these affairs. He couldn't be here. I usually don't like to do this kind of thing, but this was irresistible. Four old friends on the podium and a subject that gets more rather than less fascinating as the decades race by and the pages of biography pile up. Some of you never saw LBJ in action, unless I'm wrong about all the age levels represented in this room. So we're going to begin by giving you 10 minutes of vintage Johnson. This is his marching orders to Congress in a special message March 11th, 1965, about 10 minutes of what was titled then The American Promise and has come to be known often as the We Shall Overcome speech. We'll look at the tape first, and then I'll come back and introduce the speaker and the other panelists.
This time, on this issue, there must be no delay or no hesitation or no compromise with our purpose. We cannot, we must not refuse to protect the right of every American to vote in every election that he may desire to participate in. And we ought not, and we cannot, and we must not wait another 8 months before we get a bill. We have already waited 100 years and more, and the time for waiting is gone. So I ask you to join me in working long hours, and nights, and weekends if necessary, to pass this bill. And I don't make that request lightly. Far from the window where I sit with the problems of our country, I recognize that from outside this chamber is the outraged conscience of a nation, the grave concern of many nations, and the harsh judgment of history on our acts. But even if we pass this bill, the battle will not be over. What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement, reaches into every section and state of America. It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too, because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome. As a man whose roots go deeply into Southern soil, I know how agonizing racial feelings are. I know how difficult it is to reshape the attitudes and the structure of our society. But a century has passed, more than 100 years, since the Negro was freed. And he is not fully freed tonight. It was more than 100 years ago that Abraham Lincoln, a great president of another party, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. But emancipation is a proclamation and not a fact. A century has passed, more than 100 years, since equality was promised. And yet the Negro is not equal. A century has passed since the day of promise, and the promise is unkept. The time of justice has now come. And I tell you that I believe sincerely that no force can hold it back. It is right in the eyes of man and God that it should come. And when it does, I think that day will brighten the lives of every American. For Negroes are not the only victims. How many white children have gone uneducated? How many white families have lived in stark poverty? How many white lives have been scarred by fear because we've wasted our energy and our substance to maintain the barriers of hatred and terror? And so I say to all of you here and to all in the nation tonight, that those who appeal to you to hold on to the past do so at the cost of denying you your future. This great, rich, restless country can offer opportunity and education and hope to all black and white, all north and south, sharecropper and city dweller. These are the enemies. Poverty, ignorance, disease, they are enemies, not our fellow man, not our neighbor. And these enemies too, poverty, disease, and ignorance, we shall overcome.
That was 1965.
Like yesterday.
Like today, not just yesterday. To explore the questions of that personality and the record of that man, we've got some wonderful resources here tonight. I'll introduce them all now so that the rest of the evening can proceed without a lengthy interruption. First will come Joseph Califano, author of a recently published and fascinating biography, The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson. He was Johnson's principal aide for domestic affairs for the Great Society years, and later Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare in the Carter administration. He may have gotten more calls at 3 a.m. in the morning than any other White House aide who ever lived. Joe's going to talk about the major tensions in the Johnson presidency. Then we'll have three other deeply informed panelists to comment on that presidency and on Joe's observation before we go to you for our questions. The first will be another White House insider of that time. He's also a longtime Kennedy School colleague, Professor Francis Bator, one of the nation's most distinguished macroeconomists, who at that time was Deputy National Security Advisor, who held the international economic portfolio and was sometimes known as Europe's assistant in the Johnson administration. The second panelist will be Doris Kearns Goodwin, who was one of the earliest and most compelling of the Johnson biographers. She wrote Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream. And like Joe, Doris worked in the Johnson White House, but in her case, I think after Vietnam had begun to take its toll. As a matter of fact, I think I first met Doris in a seminar at Harvard while we were having lots of discussions about what was going on in Vietnam. She's a political scientist who's also written extensively and well, and most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with some of her work on the Kennedy family. She's now also in the Roosevelt period, so she moves around this century pretty well. I might add that one of the people involved in that speech, in the preparation of that speech, was Dick Goodwin, who is Doris's husband. And finally, we have not another insider, but like me, outside of this family, but unlike me, a seasoned, astute, and independent outsider, to join in keeping this from being a totally inside job. And that's Bob Healy, who was the former executive editor of the Boston Globe and spent a lot of time on the Johnson watch, both as a Washington correspondent and as bureau chief of the Globe in the mid-'60s. As Joe begins, you should be conscious, as he and the other members of this panel are, that we may not be alone. Whenever in those days anybody mentioned LBJ around the White House, he gave an instinctive look behind him or her, as the case may be. And I know people who still do. No names. Joe?
Thank you, Hale. In July of 1965, which was 2 months after my 34th birthday, Lyndon Johnson appointed me to be his top domestic aide on the White House staff. For the next 3.5 years, I worked with him day and night, and he used every minute of his presidency. I ate more meals with him than with my own family, and I frequently saw him early in the morning in his bedroom with Lady Bird, as other aides did, with Lady Bird pulling the covers up over her and with a bed jacket on as he went instantly to work. As soon as he woke up, there was always an aide outside with the congressional record of the day before and the cables, and whoever had the problem of the day would go to work with him at that point in the morning. And he worked until late at night. He barked orders at me over the phone and at dawn and in the formal setting of the Oval Office, and as he stood stark naked brushing his teeth in his bathroom. I watched him cry and laugh and swear and get angry and get hurt and hurt other people and dream and achieve things most others thought impossible. I saw him inspire senators and powerful citizens to put their country ahead of their careers and their companies, drive men to distraction, work as aides and cabinet members to the limit of their ability, and then get more than they realized they had left to give. I watched him endure humiliation and humiliate those he loved as well as those he hated. I saw him struggle to communicate with the American people and manipulate public opinion as the Vietnam War shackled his dreams and sapped his political firepower. And in the end, I agonized with him as he came to doubt his ability to govern and recognized that he had to sacrifice himself and withdraw from the 1968 presidential race in order to heal the divisions he had come to symbolize. The Lyndon Johnson I worked with was brave and brutal, compassionate and cruel, incredibly intelligent, and infuriatingly insensitive, with an uncanny sense of the jugular of his allies and adversaries alike. He could be altruistic and petty, caring and crude, generous and petulant, bluntly honest and calculatingly devious, all within the same few minutes. He had a marvelous, if often crude, sense of humor, and his determination, once he made up his mind to succeed, usually ran over or around whoever and whatever got in his way. He used this prodigious energy and intelligence to mount a social revolution and to control everyone and everything around him. He gave new meaning to the word Machiavellian, as he gave new hope to the disadvantaged. Johnson changed this country much more than most people realize. Let me just reflect on that for a minute. Before Johnson, there was no Medicare for the elderly, no Medicaid for the aged. There were no community health centers. There were no the Head Start. He started the Head Start program, the first funds for elementary, secondary education, the first college work-study programs, the first major college grant and scholarship programs, the country's first air, water, and noise pollution laws, the first auto emission law, created scenic rivers, scenic trails, the Historic Preservation Act, the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities, the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the Hirshhorn Museum, and in that area, that's another wonderful example of Johnson. When the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, the great sculpture garden, is named after a man named Joseph Hirshhorn, who lived in Connecticut and who said he wanted to give a sculpture, but he and Lady Bird convinced the president that this made a lot of sense. He would do it only if he could have his name on the museum. The Smithsonian didn't put the names of people on museums, particularly Latvian Jews who had come over here and made their money in a very rough way. And the president sent me up to the Hill to start working on House members because we needed a few $1 million to build this museum and to call it the Hirshhorn Museum. And as expected, there was resistance. We finally got the subcommittee chairman and a couple of others in this little green office he had off the Oval Office one day, and they said, you know, we don't, the Smithsonian doesn't do this. We don't name museums after people. We can't name this the Hirshhorn Museum. And Johnson looked across. He said, I want that sculpture in Washington for the American people to see, and if we have to call it the Horseshit Museum, we're going to get that sculpture down here. He started the mass transit program, the food stamp program, the largest housing bill in the history of the country, and a score of consumer laws. Auto safety, the seat belts you wear, the passive restraints, which we started to try and get then. He signed the Freedom of Information Act, dramatized the blight of poverty amidst affluence, and also articulated the concept of affirmative action. He wanted the advantage in any situation in which he was engaged. I learned that early when I first went to work for him. The first weekend I went down there, he was in the pool. He said, come on in the pool. He got me at a point in the pool where he could stand and I had to tread water. And he said, we have to rebuild the cities of America. I want to build to rebuild the cities of America. He kept pressing on my shoulder. He said, the transportation system is a mess. We need mass transit programs, and he said we have to get a Department of Transportation. And then he said, and we want a Fair Housing Act. He said, people, whether they're black, yellow, red, green, purple, and with each time pushing me down in the water with his finger, ought to be able to buy a house wherever they want to live if they have the money. Can you do all that? I said, yes, Mr. President. I had no idea how. He needed the Republicans in the Senate. The blacks didn't have the vote, as you could see from the clip that Hale played. The blacks didn't have the vote, and we so that there was no pressure on Southern Democratic senators to vote for a Voting Rights Act. And we needed the Senate, the Republicans, on all our civil rights bills and on many others. And Everett Dirksen was the Senate minority leader at that point in time, and he and Johnson would spend hours with Dirksen at night in the Oval Office drinking and talking to him and what have you. And Dirksen loved bourbon, Johnson enjoyed scotch, and every time the glasses were empty, they'd be refilled with only one difference. Every time Dirksen got a drink, he got 1.5 ounces of bourbon, and every time the president got a drink, he got 0.5 ounce of scotch. That was, he did believe, I think, overall, that his ends were so worthy that they justified all kinds of means. Just one or two examples. In the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was the Employment Act, it was the first time in the history of the country that cloture was ever imposed to stop a filibuster on a civil rights bill. And Humphrey was in the Senate managing the bill, and Humphrey was reporting to the president. They had great difficulty mustering the 69 votes they needed. And Humphrey mentioned a senator's name, and Johnson said, "Isn't he? He's got to be for us." And Humphrey said, "He's not." And Johnson said, "Have you talked to his mistress?" And Humphrey said, "I didn't know he had a mistress." And the president said, "That SOB, he's got a black mistress. He's got to be with us." Where is he? He's on the floor of the Senate. Hold him there. About 10 or 15 minutes later, the phone rang in the Democratic cloakroom. The senator was called to the phone. He got on the phone. Humphrey was positioned to overhear, and he heard him say, "Yes, yes, dear. I didn't know it meant that much to you, dear." And he had another vote. In the economy, the tension of the Johnson presidency was that he was going, when he decided very reluctantly to go into Vietnam, and he was not going to let his war, his buildup in Vietnam, which began in 1965, kill his dream, which was to have the Great Society, as he felt World War II had killed Roosevelt's New Deal, and Korea had ended Truman's dream of a fair deal. And that tension required that he ride these two horses. It led him to mislead the American public on the cost of the war in 1965 and 1966. Beginning in 67, we laid the cost out honestly. And it led him, in order to get his Great Society programs passed, and he had to manipulate the economy without a tax bill and without wage and price controls, which he did. But in connection with that, we went after every price you can conceive of. The aluminum companies would raise the price of aluminum, we'd go after the aluminum companies. Steel prices went up, we went after the steel companies. He got so angry at the steel companies that he said to me, he said, "You've got to call these bastards war profiteers." And I said, "Boy, I really," and he got so heated. I finally did in a background press briefing, attributable to an administration source. You all know that. Marvin Kalb knows that. That the executives at Bethlehem Steel were war profiteers. They rolled the price back. The New York Times and the Washington Post wrote the story on the front page. And a few weeks later, talking to a group of businessmen, someone said to the president, I was standing at his right side, said it was an outrage to call these businessmen war profiteers. And Johnson said, "If I find the son of a bitch who did that, I'll fire him." When the price of eggs went up, he said to Secretary of Agriculture Freeman, he said, "Orville, we got to do something about the price of eggs." Freeman said, "There's nothing we can do about the price of eggs." Johnson said, "Nonsense." He called the Surgeon General. He said, "I want warnings about cholesterol every day." And we had them. When the price of wood went up, he prohibited the federal government from buying wooden desks. And those of you who have been in the government, that's why you have that awful gray plastic and steel all over the federal government. He wanted to control everything and legislate for everything. If he couldn't reach you, it was incredible. He couldn't reach me the first couple of weeks I was there in my office. He said, he called, I was in a John. I had a little John off my office. And he said to my secretary, "Isn't there a phone in there?" She said, "No, Mr. President." He said, "Put a phone in there." I didn't put a phone in there. The next day he called me at the same time, caught me in the same place, and he had Army Signal Corps men to put the phone in, waiting in the office by the time I got out. He ran me down once at Sibley Hospital, and my son Joe was here. He was 3 years old at the time, and he had swallowed, and he said, "What the hell are you doing at Sibley Hospital?" I said, "My son swallowed a bottle of aspirin." And he asked if he could help and what have you. And then after a short pause, he said, "You know, these kids shouldn't be able to get into these bottles." He said, "We need to stop that." And that accounts, incidentally, for the Child Safety Act, which we proposed later that year, and which is why none of you can open your pills. In the 89th Congress alone, he proposed 200 major pieces of legislation, and he passed 183. He had a marvelous sense of humor, even in all respects. Senator Fulbright was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He really had a way of irritating Johnson. And one day the president said to me, he said, "You know, Fulbright is a revolving son of a bitch. You know what that is?" I said, "No, Mr. President, I don't." He said, "That's a guy that's a son of a bitch no matter how you look at him." He also, Senator Mark Hatfield, who's still in the Senate, really got under Johnson's skin on the war. He kept saying three men, Johnson, Rusk, and McNamara, didn't have the moral authority to send people to war. And we were up in the living quarters one Sunday morning. It was a religious broadcast, and Hatfield was on, and he was talking to this preacher, and he said, "You know, sometimes," Senator Hatfield said on the television tube, he said, "You know, sometimes when I drive on the roads of Oregon, I'm so moved, I pull my car over to the side of the road, and I get down on my knees and thank God and pray to him for the beauty he's given me." Johnson slapped his hand on my knee. He said, "Let that be a lesson to you. You don't ever trust a son of a bitch who pulls over to the side of the road to pray." Even in his darkest moments, Johnson had that sense of humor. After Martin Luther King was assassinated, the country was really in turmoil. Those of you that were really functioning and around in those days will remember that. We had riots in 200 American cities. We had troops in about half a dozen. And in Washington, we had about 20 or 30 fires. And the second night was the worst night. And I was bringing the president messages every hour, bringing him executive orders to sign. And on the second night, I brought him a message, FBI report that said Stokely Carmichael, the Black Power advocate, was organizing a mob in Washington to march on Georgetown and burn it down. And Georgetown is the posh Washington enclave, as you know, where all the Washington Post editors and the liberal columnists lived, and TV commentators. And Johnson read this, and he said, "God damn, I've waited 35 years for this night." He had strong feelings about a variety of things. I won't go into them in detail. I will give you a little bit of an assessment of tension.
Is that why Martin Luther King was killed by the FBI?
Martin Luther King was killed by James Earl Ray, not by the FBI.
James Earl Ray was everything.
Johnson had his problems with Hubert Humphrey. He eventually concluded that he was weak, and he wanted Nelson Rockefeller to succeed him as president of the United States, and indeed encouraged and in a secret dinner got Rockefeller to run. A quick summation. In a nation of unprecedented wealth, Johnson simply refused to accept poverty. There was no child he couldn't feed, no adult he couldn't put to work, no disease he couldn't cure, no toy or food or medical device he couldn't make safer, no air or water he couldn't clean, no discriminatory barrier he couldn't topple, just as there was no war he could not win and no ceasefire or peace he couldn't negotiate. For sure, he made overpromises, but they were based on high hopes and great expectations and on his phenomenal ability to move the system. At times, he lost sight of the fact that laws were not an end in themselves, perpetually trying to get everyone, business, labor, churches, schools, cities and states, working on every problem. At moments, Johnson failed to accept that he couldn't do it all. His own singular capacity to enact so many laws and programs led him to overestimate the capacity of the government to administer them. It was a reflection of his immense ego, but it was also a measure of his ability to see the difference between his responsibilities as president and as a legislator, and it sprang from his roots, as you could tell a little in that clip, in the harsh, dry hill country of poor farmers and Mexican Americans, in the South where he saw blacks endure degrading humiliation. He saw an America with the economic wealth to wage both wars. His feeling, as he sensed it, was that he couldn't inspire the people to stay both courses. Vietnam took a frightful toll on the nation and the president. Its bloody battles sapped the American spirit and took thousands of young lives. No matter how Johnson mustered his persuasive powers, he couldn't communicate to the American people why he was convinced we had to be there, and if we were there, why it made sense to walk his line between all-out war and surrender so we could continue to deal with domestic problems. Perhaps it was because Johnson himself, contrary to the caricature of the day, was so reluctant to be there and so frustrated that the war against poverty and ignorance and disease, which he wanted to wage, was being subverted by the war in Asia, which he felt he had to wage. But the Vietnam War ended 4 years after he left, and much of the Great Society survived. Its impact remains in health care for the old and land preserved, an environmental movement still gaining momentum in Head Start and the miracles in the National Institutes of Health, in thousands of black elected officials across the nation, and the rise of a black middle class. Of course, the Great Society didn't solve all the problems it set out to correct. Social programs failed to achieve their goals for much of the black underclass, and the specter of racial prejudice and poverty amidst affluence still haunt the American addict. And the fruits of some programs, like Medicare, brought new problems like the aging of America. New ills like drug addiction plagued the nations. At his best, Lyndon Johnson put the thumb of government forcefully on the scale for the vulnerable among us and brought talented people into public service. Almost to the point of nagging, he reminded the American people that God and history would judge them not just on how much the gross national product grew, but on how they spent it. Not simply on how many millionaires the nation's booming economy produced, but on how many millions of people it lifted out of poverty. Not simply on how many miles of highways and roads they built, but on how many acres of land they preserved and restored. At his worst, Johnson destroyed his own credibility. He hid the cost of the military buildup in Vietnam as the war first unfolded. He heard what he wanted and hoped to hear from the military and passed their optimistic reports on to the people. He lied about little things like appointments to office and his schedule, and he learned too late that the manipulative and devious behavior commonplace in the back alleys of legislative politics appalled the American people when exposed in their president. He paid a fearful price as first the press corps in Washington and Saigon, and then millions of Americans came to doubt his word. He never seemed able to accept what the war did to the American spirit. Astonishingly, this president of powerful presence and remarkable intelligence, penetrating psychological insights, and enormous political talent, was insecure. He longed to be recognized for his achievements. He wanted to be loved for them. His envy for the glamour that surrounded the Kennedys in life and the adulation that attended them in death was Shakespearean. He yearned for appreciation from the Ivy League intellectuals whose ideas he turned into law, from the young to whom he opened the doors of higher education, and from the poor and the black. But the policies to which he devoted his presidency and his complex personality denied him the affection of the people who elected him their president. Lyndon Johnson did have the courage to accept the inevitable risks of his policies, but it didn't ease the pain when he was attacked as not doing enough for blacks or as being a cavalier gunslinger who didn't care enough about the lives at risk in South Vietnam. He knew, as he said at the time, that his pursuit of racial justice carried a high price for himself and his party. He chose consciously to keep that appointment in Samara. At bottom in the White House, he was on many matters a true believer, using the street-smart skills, cunning, and pragmatic politics which he had honed in the legislature to promote the domestic agenda of his presidency. He was prepared to land on his sword if that's what it took, to advance the cause of the poor and the black, to resist communist aggression in Southeast Asia, and to heal the divisions in our nation that he had come to symbolize. Consumed and driven, Johnson had his moments of frustration to the cusp of despair. Much of the years in retirement was spent wondering how he might have moved the ball a little further down the field. And in the last public speech of his life, when his civil rights papers were open to the public, Johnson said, "Well, this cry of never, I've heard it since I was a little boy, all my life. And what we commemorate this great day is some of the work which has helped to make never now." Through it all, the war, the hurt, the devious and crude behavior, the ghosts of the Kennedys, the ambition for his country and himself, during what he called the most serious years confronted by his country in the course of his lifetime, Johnson never lost his concentration on trying to make never now. He left plenty of achievements to build on and plenty of mistakes to learn from. However history measures those successes and failures, it must recognize that Lyndon Johnson cared and that he tried. Thank you.
If you want to find out how the United States government works when a powerful president, those of you who've seen the Katharine Hepburn, Peter O'Toole line in Winter, think of the Henry II character, the Texas version of the Henry II character. It really is right. Anyway, when a powerful president is determined to change how the country works and to act as the government's choreographer, conductor, stage manager, if you want to find how things are in that kind of White House, don't walk, run tomorrow morning to the bookstore and buy Joe Califano's book. It's the best first-hand description by far of the working of Lyndon Johnson. And as you've heard, the stories are terrific. I have my own, but I only have 8 minutes. So I'll postpone them until 3, 4, 5 years from now. I'll do my smaller book, and please come back. The 8 minutes are tough because when I started thinking about what I would say about Lyndon Johnson in that little time, he absorbed my life for 3.5 years, not as much as he absorbed Joe's, but quite enough. I kept thinking about the Woody Allen character who said something like, I read War and Peace in 20 minutes. It's about Russia. I want to say something first about Johnson and non-Vietnam foreign policy, and then I'll say something about Johnson and Vietnam. The canonical view of LBJ is that he was a master of domestic policy and politics, but no good at foreign policy. And if you judge by Vietnam only, that's a hard case to rebut. But there was more to Lyndon Johnson's foreign policy than Vietnam. In our complicated relations with the major European countries, and after Mac Bundy left, I took over that portfolio. And our relations were complicated with de Gaulle in the LSA, Germany an uncertain transition from a hard Cold War stance to Ostpolitik, Britain in deep economic trouble and retrenching abroad. In relations with that set of countries, the president was a decisive force for restraint and good sense. For example, he understood much better than most of his senior advisors, and they included Dean Acheson, who was known as the Mustache in the White House basement, John McCloy and George Bull. President knew much better that angry tit-for-tat was not the way to respond to the French withdrawal from NATO or French threats to raid Fort Knox or spoiling tactics in Brussels or Geneva, that American overreaction would play right into that grand old man's hands. He understood that the key to good alliance relations was never to overload the other fellow's politics, or almost never, And it's not surprising. After all, in Mac Bundy's phrase, he was a very majority leaderish commander-in-chief. Dealing with Harold Wilson or Kurt Kiesinger was not all that different from dealing with Everett Dirksen or Wayne Morse. Even more important, he decisively speeded up the shift in American-Soviet policy away from rigid Cold War to peaceful engagement, and on the side helped nudge German policy in that direction too. He understood that the most important foreign policy business confronting the United States was to help Moscow and ourselves to grow out of the Cold War and to begin putting the lid on the nuclear race. Read his great European policy speech of October 7, 1966. All sorts of people have claimed credit for that remarkable speech. I know where every idea and every word came from in that speech, and more than most presidential speeches, it was Lyndon Johnson's speech. One result of all that was the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Worried about breaking an old Kennedy promise to the Germans to keep European nuclear options open, the State Department, including the Secretary of State, dead opposed to the Non-Proliferation Treaty on any terms that the Russian could accept. The President told Dean Rusk face to face that he wanted that treaty and he wanted him, Dean Rusk, to get it for him. To the great credit of the Secretary of State, he did just that. Another result was the meeting with Kosygin in Glassboro. And what would have been, had it not been for the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia, the beginning of serious SALT negotiations during the late summer of 1968. But then there was Vietnam. The usual story is that LBJ chose not to choose between the Great Society and the Vietnam War, and that it was a case of tragedy in the strict Greek sense of the word, that the fault lay in the President himself, his immoderation, his inability to accept limits. The underlying supposition is that had Johnson done in July 65 what most of us think he should have done, backed away from what he thought was an Eisenhower-John Kennedy commitment to what became with the Diem coup, a government made in Washington, that there would not have followed a bitter who turned tail in Indochina debate, and the great legislation of 65, 66 would have remained undamaged. There is a competing hypothesis, and lots of evidence that it is what the President himself thought, and who knew the Congress better. Counterfactual prediction backwards, it's what historians do even when they don't know it, is an iffy business. But according to this second story, holding the line on Vietnam in 65, 66 was the inescapable price of the Great Society and civil rights crimes of those years. In other words, the triumph in the title of Joe's book would not have been within Johnson's reach had he failed to take the actions in 65 that produced the tragedy. The minor premise of that hypothesis is that what he did in 65 was necessary to prevent a rapid disintegration in South Vietnam. The major premise is that collapse in Saigon would have led to a still nastier rerun of the Who Lost China debate of 49-52, and that such a debate would have destroyed Johnson's power to command the Congress just as surely as it destroyed the second Truman administration. That, I think, was the President's nightmare. Indeed, he thought, I think, that the attack on him for failing to honor President Kennedy's commitment in Vietnam might well be led by Robert Kennedy. But then both of those remarkable men thought that the other one had horns. In light of what Vietnam wrought, and the fact that we had no first-order stake in that poor country, one has to wish that President Johnson had taken that chance. But that is quite different than saying that the choice was obvious and would have been costless, and that it was only Lyndon Johnson's psyche that got in the way. My own conclusion is that if you're serious about doing something as president, as distinct from just wanting to be president, and unless you are very lucky, it's a terrible job. The perks are not worth it. One last reflection. What JFK would have done about Vietnam is unknowable. But that he was the one fellow who could have said, that's it, it's their war, in July '65, and gotten away with it at home, strikes me as more than likely. After all, he confronted Khrushchev, and the other fellow blinked. And JFK didn't have nightmares about what the Kennedys might do to him.
Well, unlike Joe and Francis, I saw Lyndon Johnson not at the height of his power, but mostly in the last sad years of his life. My relationship began much less auspiciously than theirs as well. I had been a graduate student here at Harvard in 1967, involved as so many people were in the anti-war marches, and somehow was selected to try out to be a White House fellow, to work in the White House or one of the cabinet offices. Just before I went down for the final selection, I had written an article with a friend of mine on the need for a third-party movement to overthrow Lyndon Johnson in 1968. And the New Republic were sort of interested, but they weren't sure about it. So I went down. I was selected as a White House fellow. We had a dance at the White House, and Lyndon Johnson asked me to dance. There were only 3 women who were selected as White House fellows, so it wasn't so unusual. But I can still remember being stunned by that first appearance. My only image until that point had been what we saw on television, this character with these huge ears that looked like pendants hanging from his head, his face fixed in immobility, and that terrible look of those granny glasses, and the podium that he would catch onto as if he let it go. In fact, he called it Mother. Something would be gone if he didn't have his podium. And here in life, he was such a man filled with vitality, such an incredible storyteller, just talking that night. I later learned that one of the reasons for the stiffnesses of his public appearances, he knew how crude and wonderful and vulgar and terrific his stories were. He was afraid if he deviated from his text, he would be known as the crudest president. He might have been, but oh, so much more interesting than the man we saw. At any rate, that night in the middle of our dance, he told me I would be his personal White House fellow. All was fine and good until the next day the New Republic decided to publish the article. And they put on it a title, How to Dump LBJ in 1968. Well, I was certain not only that he wouldn't let me come to Washington, but that he would disband the entire White House Fellows program. He was wont to do that. But instead, in an interesting moment of his character, he said, oh, let her come to Washington. If I can't win her over in a year, no one can. So down to Washington I went, and in the last 6 or 8 months of his presidency, I worked in the White House with him and then went down to the ranch with him to help him on his memoirs. I'm not so sure he ever won me over about the war, but certainly he created a great empathy in me for his person. It was an incredible experience to see this giant of a man at the age of 23, 24 years old, which is all I was at that time. It was also a very sad and poignant experience, because here was this man who had been, as Joe so greatly described, really, as he called himself, the leader of the whole Western world, now reduced to running a ranch in the hill country of Texas. There was no outlet for all that enormous energy that had fueled him for so many years. Though he had houses, though he had cars, though he had that incredible pool that Joe described, which by the time I got there was filled with floating sandwiches that came by on floating trays with floating dishes, floating muzak, floating desks. Everything he wanted sort of came around him. And still, without power, without the chance to effect change in his world, his spirit was really drained of all vitality. It was as if somehow the artificial life force that had kept him going all those years, power, once it was gone, there was nothing left in this incredible man. Whereas before he could make 10 or 12 speeches in a day, his legendary energy unmatched by anyone, now he'd be frightened at every speech he was asked to give, and at the last minute would invariably cancel the speeches. Whereas before he could shake 1,000 hands and come back feeling renewed from the flow of power that came from the audience, now when he shook 5 people's hands, he would come back and his hands would be filled with blisters from the exchange that had taken place minus power. In these lonely days, he tended to wake up very early in the mornings, and after a while a ritual developed between us, whereas Lady Bird would sleep and he knew I awakened early, so I awakened even earlier than he did, and he would come into my room. I would get out of the bed, sit with a robe on a chair, and he would get himself into the bed, pull the covers up to his neck, and talk to me about his past, about his mother, about his father, about what he wished had been true. And I realize now, much more than I did then, when you're young, you take it all for granted. I think now I realize what a great gift it was, in a certain way, for me to see what happens to somebody for whom power is so central to their lives that nothing is left. It made me understand more in personal life about the importance of having some sort of balance, which I may never have seen had I not had that chance to see it so close up. I know in those last weeks of his life, his only hope really was that he would be remembered by the black Americans. He knew in his heart that he had done more than even he was asked to at the time for civil rights. And my own hope is that someday people will truly remember that he deserves to be remembered for that. When I was watching the clip of the We Shall Overcome speech, and as was mentioned by Hale, my husband had worked in part on that speech. My husband has a wonderful story to tell of the months that preceded that speech. As you know, it was the Selma March, and George Wallace was one of the big figures at that time that Johnson had to worry about what he was going to do. And at a certain point, George Wallace called and said he wanted to meet with Lyndon Johnson, and here was Johnson's incredible understanding of physical power. He brings Wallace into the White House Oval Office. Wallace stood only about 5 feet 2 inches tall. Johnson was, of course, like 6'3" and 200 pounds. So he immediately put Wallace in this low plush couch so that Wallace sunk even further down to the floor. And then he seated himself in this hard rocking chair, and he leaned over to Wallace so that his nose is almost touching Wallace's. And then, with a flash of brilliance, he talks to him about all sorts of things. He says, "I saw you criticizing me today, George." And he says, "No, sir, I wasn't criticizing you. I was just criticizing, states' rights I was defending." And he said, "No, I saw you on that television screen. You was criticizing me, George. I have 3 televisions, and every single one of them. And you was mighty persuasive, old George." And then he goes on to say to George, "Now look, George, how do you want to be remembered in history? Do you want to have a small, little, scrawny gravestone that says, 'George Wallace, he hated people'? Or do you want to have a big marble temple that says, 'George Wallace, he built for his people'?" Wallace evidently gets up out of this meeting and goes outside, and he says, "Oh, thank God I got out of there. He would have had me coming out for civil rights." But it was that incredible understanding of physical power. Johnson always violated human space. He would stand too close to you so that when you talked to him, like when I would talk to him, being short as I was, I felt like I was being crushed in this enormous stomach that was never quite flat. I can remember one story that I've told before, that when I first went down to the ranch, he made me feel very special by letting me ride in the front seat of his car as he took visitors around the ranch. And he would make me feel like I was in the position of honor. It could be the Prime Minister of Great Britain in the back of the car, but he's telling me, "Doris, look at the jumping antelope, look at the bluebonnets, look at my birthhouse." And you feel pretty special. Until a couple weeks later, I didn't go down one weekend to the ranch, and he got angry with me. So the next weekend I'm there, Dean Rusk is there. And Dean Rusk is in the front of the car, and I'm in the back of the car. And he's saying, "Look, Dean, look at the jumping antelope. Look at the bluebonnets." And I remember feeling like I'd been exiled to Siberia as I sat in the back of the car. And then I thought, what is the matter with me? I don't even want to be in this car. I've seen these stupid bluebonnets 100 times. But it was a measure of this man's brilliance that he could turn any situation into one of power and make you feel so sad. I remember that day was when I made the determination that I'd never work for him full time, that even though he wanted me, he told me he'd get me anything I wanted if I came down to Texas. He said, you like to write, I'll get you a lake, you'll have a cabin. You writers need those kind of things, right? You want a man, I'll find you a millionaire every weekend. I'm the President of the United States, your field is the presidency, I'm going to travel around the world. What's the matter with you, girl? And I remember for the moment I thought, what is the matter with me? Why aren't I going? Until I remembered that I wasn't strong enough to withstand this power on a 24-hour-a-day basis, certainly not at 24 years old. One other funny story that when Joe was talking about the pool reminds me of, which always seems to me both the greatness and the craziness of Lyndon Johnson. Hugh Sidey had written a book that came out while Johnson was in his last year in the presidency, And I had read the book, and in it, Sadi talked about the fact that Johnson had given a wonderful speech to the troops in which he talked about the great patriotism that coursed through his own body because his great-great-grandfather had died at the Battle of the Alamo. And having read the book that day, Sadi also said there was only one problem with this wonderful speech. He didn't have a great-great-grandfather who died at the Battle of the Alamo. He just wished he did so much that he had made him up. So I said to him, Mr. President, how can you do this? How can you just make up somebody like this? And he turns to me with water splashing all over, and he said, oh, these journalists, they're such sticklers for detail. And then he goes on to describe, he said, you know, they'd make you try and remember the color of the wallpaper the first night you made love, and they'd forget to ask you about the experience itself. They're always off on the wrong track. And he described how his great-great-grandfather had really died at the Battle of San Jacinto, so it was a little slip of the tongue. And he was so wonderful for half an hour telling me why that battle was more important than the Alamo, that by the time he finished, I was sure that he was right, that Hugh Sadi had been a stickler for detail. Until years later, when I did my biography, I discovered that he hadn't died there either. That, in fact, he had died at home in bed. Well, during those years, one of the things that was complicated was being young, knowing how powerful Johnson was, and being a woman meant that I was always aware that maybe the reason I was there was not because I thought I was so smart, that I was from Harvard, that I was in the anti-war movement, that he cared about this side of the world, but maybe it was just because I was a woman. So there was always that need to sort of keep some distance from this giant character. And things seemed to go pretty well. I mean, I treated it, I would say, somewhat immaturely. I treated him like you would treat someone in high school when you wanted to keep a distance. It was the only way I knew how to do it. At any rate, things were going great until one day he told me he wanted to discuss our relationship. And that just brought a chill to me because I remembered I had this friend in high school named Moose, who I always wanted to keep as my friend. I didn't want him to be my boyfriend. And he always wanted to discuss our relationship, which I knew what it meant. So I had this memory, oh God. It got worse when he took me to a picnic that day, and he had wine and a checkered tablecloth, and we went to the lake, conveniently called Lake LBJ. And he said, now, Doris, I want to tell you something so special. And I thought, oh God. And he said, more than any other woman I've ever known. And I just remember catching my breath, and then he said, you remind me of my mother. It was one of those moments of great humiliation. Now, one of the things that Joe said that I think captures Johnson so perfectly is that yearning for appreciation, that desire for love, that insecurity that maybe I saw more even than people during the days of high power saw because he was so vulnerable in those last years of his life, but I think insightful people saw even at the height of his glory. My own funny remembrance of that is that at the ranch he had this wonderful desire to give gifts to everybody who visited him. And he had what almost amounted to a warehouse filled with gifts. Depending on how many times you came down there, you got to choose from a different level. And the presents at the bottom level were not as good as the presents at the top level, almost like an amusement park. So at the beginning I got the presents like scarves that had LBJ embroidered onto them. And eventually I had a watch that had LBJ's picture on it. And finally, I worked myself up to the top shelf. And I can still remember, like a little kid at Christmas, he said, now, you know, we've become really close friends. It's now time for you to choose from the top shelf. And the top shelf was all wrapped. And I opened it up, and he said, you're going to love this present because you're going to think of me every morning and every night when you see this wonderful present. So I opened it up, and inside was this huge electric toothbrush with his picture and the presidential seal on it. And I thought to myself, oh my God, this man is right. I will think of him every morning and every night. It got even more bizarre because a month later I was down there again and he gives me the same spiel and we're on the top shelf and he said, I love this present. And I opened it up and yet another toothbrush came floating out. And I said to him, but I already have one of these. And he said, oh, you people from Harvard, you're so ungrateful. Take the toothbrush. So I got 13 toothbrushes before he died. But in the end, as I thought about it, what it really was this man wanted he thought the gift would make me come back to the ranch. He didn't trust that at that point I really loved him as a person. I would have come back to that ranch minus gifts, certainly minus stupid toothbrushes to bring me back every week. And somehow in a larger metaphorical sense, I think when he gave aid to the disabled, when he gave aid to the handicapped, when he gave aid to students, when he gave laws for the blacks, when he promoted programs for the poor, when he promoted programs for the sick, what he really wanted was for those people to be grateful and somehow to give him affection, to give him thanks. What was so hard for him to understand was that government isn't that kind of a relationship, and that when the students demonstrated, when the blacks rioted, when the poor people were upset, Some of those expectations and those upsetments were part of the process. He saw it personally as if it were going against him, as if they were ungrateful for things that he had done, and the whole dynamic of government had somehow mystified him at that point. I remember in those last months of his life, he kept talking about the hope that in the Great Society he had created a beautiful woman. And he had this incredible metaphor where with each law that he put on the books, she was going to become more and more beautiful. And so fat and buxom. He liked these big women, I guess. And somehow the bigger she got, the more permanent she got, no one would ever forget him. But then he thought in that last year of his life, as he watched the Great Society being dismantled by Richard Nixon, that this beautiful woman was being starved systematically as each law was taken off the books. She was getting skinnier and skinnier and uglier, and that someday she'd be put in a closet because no one would want to see her anymore. And when that happened, he said, he too would die. He had this terrible fear in those last months of his life that he somehow was going to be a footnote between John Kennedy on the one hand and Robert Kennedy on the other hand. I was with him when Bobby Kennedy died, and his first reaction was a very strange one. He said it would have killed him to see Bobby Kennedy become president and to have to watch him march to hail to the chief. But on the other hand, if Bobby had become president, then at least there would have been a live human Kennedy to compare to Lyndon Johnson, rather than these two mythical figures that he would always be forced to be a footnote between. 2 days before he died, he called me. I was a young teacher here at Harvard. And with real sadness in his voice, he said that he had the feeling that the American public would be forever fickle and would never really remember him. He was reading Carl Sandburg's biography on Lincoln, trying to bring Lincoln to life, and he couldn't do it. And he said he had a feeling if he couldn't do that, that no one would ever remember him. And he said in some ways all his life he had been questing after immortality. Maybe it would have been better for a fleeting moment, he said, if he had spent his time with his children, his wife, his children's children, and sought that kind of immortality instead of from the American people whose love he could no longer trust. I remember trying to sort of jolly him out of his sad mood by saying, oh, don't worry, they'll never forget you. At least I'll put a question on every one of my exams here at Harvard so the students will have to remember you. He said, I'm not being funny. You're not understanding. I'm telling you that maybe it's all crazy to go after the search that I've gone after. 2 days later, alone in his room, the very thing he feared so much, that he would have people sit outside his bedroom sometimes so that when he took a nap he wouldn't have to feel that he was alone. He was all alone in his bedroom. He called the Secret Service, and by the time they reached his room, he had already died. My own sense is, however, that while the war will always be a blot on his reputation and will always in many ways have destroyed many of the things that he tried so hard to build, that as time goes by, there's no question that someone so alive, just as Joe said, who tried, who cared, will come back to life. And I'm so glad we have a chance to bring it to you tonight. Thank you.
I'd like to put in a small plug for Joe's book. It's a great book with quivering anecdotes, which I'm sure when you read it, you'll get the connection. I didn't know Lyndon Johnson the way Doris Goodman, Joe Califano, or Francis Bertor knew him. But I went to Washington when Johnson was Majority Leader of the Senate, and his mentor, Sam Rabin, was Speaker of the House. I've always thought that these were probably the happiest years of Johnson's life in Washington. Dwight Eisenhower was in the White House, and there was an implicit pact between these three leaders that nothing would be initiated by Eisenhower, by the Eisenhower administration, without the consent of Johnson and Rayburn. Remember, these were days of real authority in Washington. Judge Smith, the tyrant chairman of the Rules Committee, would disappear into the Virginia hillside with civil rights legislation and hold the legislation up for months and years. And you didn't get an appointment to the Ways and Means Committee in the House unless one committed never to vote against the oil depletion allowance. Rabin didn't talk to freshman members, despite the stories, and Johnson did business with a handful of Democratic Policy Committee members. Johnson was larger than life as Senate leader. And I think beneath this real power, there was the clear belief in Johnson's mind that he would be the next president of the United States. I remember getting the Johnson treatment in late 1959. I had been to the West Coast for a couple of weeks with John Kennedy. Kennedy had made a trip to the primary states of California, where he had done some battle with Governor Pat Brown, a Catholic, who earlier had been reminded by Johnson that there could be only one Catholic on the ticket. Later, we went to Oregon, where Kennedy was assessing his presidential prospects there in the primary. When I returned from the trip, Johnson asked if I would come down to the Majority Leader's office. This was an invitation normally reserved for either Lyndon's old pals in the Senate press gallery, such as columnist Bill White or Joe Alsop, or the big hitters like Scotty Reston of the Times. But there were no stars in my eyes. Johnson wanted information. How did Kennedy do, he asked me. What was his response to Pat Brown when Brown sandbagged Kennedy by organizing a rally for him in Oakland and 22 people showed up? Did Harry Bridges' Union longshoreman in Coos Bay, Oregon, give Kennedy the freeze because of his Senate record on unions? Would Edith Green, the liberal congresswoman from Oregon, be with Kennedy? Johnson began all this from behind his desk. Then he began marching around the room, asking us questions. Finally, he came to the purpose of my visit. He came close to me, massaged my back with his big hand, and began to tell me what a great guy Kennedy was and what a great future he had in the Senate. Then he grabbed me by the lapels, stuck his nose in my face, and said, "You don't think this skinny little guy from Massachusetts is going to be the President of the United States, do you?" Johnson was haunted by the Kennedys. He spent 3 of the worst years of his life in Washington as vice president. Kennedy would tell the story of shooting a deer at the LBJ ranch and how Lyndon staked deers to trees, and when Kennedy shot 5 feet over the head of the deer from Johnson's open convertible, the deer fell dead with a shot of another rifle. How Lyndon presented the mounted deer head to him for hanging in FDR's fish room in the White House, but the deer was never hung. Johnson was no more abused as vice president than other vice presidents before him, but few vice presidents had had his power. Certainly no one demeaned than he demeaned his vice president, Hubert Humphrey. But what was important here was how this left Johnson as president. He never escaped the Kennedy shadow. James Reston, in his book Deadline, wrote about the meeting with the president early in 1962 and being interrupted by an aide who showed Johnson a clip of a Time magazine article which told of Johnson's driving at reckless speed while drinking on a lonely Texas road. Reston quoted the president as saying, "I know why you came to see me. You wanted me to tell you whether I thought Bobby Kennedy was going to run against me this year. Well," he said, "you've got the wrong question. The question is not whether he will run, but whether I'll run." When they print things like that, I don't know how a Southern president can unify this country. These big city folk in the national press are against me. They're trying to make a hick out of me. That was Johnson's big problem. Kennedy crawled into Johnson's head at Los Angeles in 1960 at the joint Texas-Massachusetts delegation caucus at the Democratic National Convention, where Kennedy outpointed Johnson in debate and went on to win the convention nomination. Johnson could not believe this skinny little guy from Boston could beat him. It had to be something else: the Harvard advisors, the Kennedy wealth, Kennedy's father, or Lyndon's Southern heritage. It would not have mattered if it had no bearing on Lyndon Johnson's presidency, but it did. Califano, in his new book, The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson, gets at this subject. How Johnson, when Bobby Kennedy tried to get Secretary of State Dean Rusk fired in 1963 and 1964, valued Rusk's opinions even more, and rare for Johnson, had almost complete trust trust in Rusk's loyalty, largely because Kennedy tried to get him fired. He tells how the community action programs, the controversial inner city programs, which taught the poor how to be political active, might be used by the Kennedys as political arms to run against Johnson. But most of all, I believe the Kennedy factor was at work in the course of the war in Vietnam. Sam Raidman had advised Johnson long before he became president that he would do well listening to some county sheriffs rather than Harvard graduates. He didn't. He couldn't escape from the advice of Mac Bundy and the whiz kids at the Pentagon, Kennedy people nearly all. I don't believe the course Johnson took would have been Kennedy's course in Vietnam. I think Kennedy would have done what he had already done in Laos, basically neutralized the country. Johnson, as Califano writes, was also driven to do more than Kennedy on civil rights and settling the steel negotiations at which Kennedy had failed during his administration, on environmental issues, and his refusal to accept poverty in what was a rich nation. Some of this, too, I believe, was Kennedy-driven. Joe Califano writes, at times he lost sight of the fact that laws were not an end in themselves. His own singular capacity to enact so many laws and programs led him to overestimate the capacity of government to administer and the nation to absorb so much so fast. In the end, I think Lyndon Johnson, this huge man, both in spirit and mind, was defeated by his own insecurity and a myth he carried around in his head, and he was better than that. Thank you.
We've had a number of remarkable portraits of this multifaceted man. I guess we are now prepared to take questions. Want to start over here?
I don't know if this is working. A brief but I think important comment and then a question. The comment is, Mr. Califano, you spoke about how Johnson lied to the American people about the war. And then you went on to describe it as communist aggression in Vietnam, not U.S. aggression, for example. I'd like to suggest that that was probably the central fiction of the Johnson administration about the war in Vietnam, the central lie. My question is, it escapes me for the moment.
The emphasis here is on questions.
Right. Yeah, I know. I do. Go ahead.
I have a question up here. Did the Johnson...
Come to the microphone and take your turn like everybody else, please.
To any of the members on the panel, I wonder if there could be some elaboration on the selection process of the members of the Warren Commission. I'd like to know who the advisors were who led to Johnson's selection of Allen Dulles, for example, John McCloy, Gerald Ford, members of the Warren Commission.
I don't know how the Warren Commission was selected. I can tell you that, as I've written, President Johnson did not agree with the conclusions of the Warren Commission. The Kennedys had tried for over 2 years to assassinate Fidel Castro, and he believed that Castro, his exact words to me were, Kennedy tried to get Castro, but Castro got Kennedy first. He believed that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone. We looked at reopening the Warren Commission report, and the president decided not to. One, because he didn't. He was concerned about what it would do for the country and what it would do for the Kennedy family. I don't have I wrote that on the basis of what the president had told me. Bob Dallek, who's now working on the presidential years, told me that he has gotten Freedom of Information Act requests which confirm Johnson's belief, which confirm that Johnson believed that Castro was responsible for Kennedy's assassination. And confirmed, obviously, what I think it's been, that the Kennedys were trying very hard to assassinate Castro.
Oh,
Go to this microphone
well, just
now.
a follow-up quickly. It's just on the memo from Nicholas Katzenbach to Bill Moyers that the country had to be convinced that Lee Harvey Oswald was the sole assassin. Why was that?
I'm not familiar with that memo.
But I think
Let me go. Excuse me.
I was just going to say,
something, Doris.
clearly you have to remember the state of the country at that time, where you had a man who'd just become president who came from Texas. As he put it, he felt like he was naked and illegitimate. He had come from the state where the murder had taken place, where the murder of the murderer had taken place. And he knew that the country was in such a state of shock that the most important thing was to get on and to go forward. And wait a second. I'm just explaining. Well, I'm not talking about who did it or not. I'm just trying to understand why it was that it was in both Johnson's interest as president to bind this country together, the Kennedys' interest for all the reasons that we've now learned, because there were so many concerns they had about what they'd been doing with Castro, perhaps about Sam Giancana, perhaps about the mafia, so that the two major forces that could have kept this thing alive for separate reasons wanted at that time to bring closure. So that's what's left us now, with that process being so unsatisfactory, and left everybody on the outside having to figure it out so many years later. But that mood has to be understood at the time.
Let's go on to the next question over here.
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Califano, and I just have a couple of excerpts from a couple of things Mr. Beta said and Mrs. Goodwin said. I'd just like to recap first. Mr. Beta, you said that LBJ was no good at foreign relations. That's your exact quote. Mrs. Goodwin, you said that you made allusion to a artificial life force or power. And you said something to the effect that LBJ did not trust the American people, he trusted somebody else. Now, Mr. Califano, you specifically said his build-up in Vietnam. You referred specifically to LBJ's build-up in Vietnam, when it becomes quite clear to any serious student of accurate history that LBJ was completely controlled by the Council on Foreign Relations, and that the Council on Foreign Relations got us in and kept us in the Vietnam War.
I think question time has come again. Could we have your question, please?
That is the question. The question is, how can you have the effrontery to say to us people that LBJ got us in and kept us in the Vietnam War, when it's quite clear that he was surrounded by an entourage of CFR members in the Oval Office?
Let me note, incidentally, I'll comment briefly on that, but that I think Mr. Bator said that Johnson
bypassing the powers of Congress
was very good. It was very good at foreign policy in the non-Vietnam area. I was in the Pentagon during 1964, and up until mid-1965, actually came to the White House the week in which Johnson finally made the decision. There's no question in my mind but that the entire administration, with the exception of George Ball, wanted to build up in Vietnam. There's no question in my mind but that every single Kennedy advisor except Ball, and he was not a favorite of Kennedy, wanted to build up much more than Lyndon Johnson did build up in Vietnam. And the paper record supports that overwhelmingly. We in the Pentagon thought that we would be able to go in and send in more troops and bomb more virtually the day after the election. Johnson held off for 6 months, and probing every aspect of that decision, sending McGeorge Bundy out there, sending McNamara out there a couple of times, sending Henry Cabot Lodge out there. I was not a member of the Council of Foreign Relations at that time, incidentally. And I think it was very much his decision. He decided to do it. He did believe, there's no question about it, he believed that he was carrying out a policy that Eisenhower had begun and that Kennedy had continued. He also was not the first one to mislead the American people about Vietnam. Kennedy lied about Vietnam, as we all know. There used to be a joke in the Pentagon that there were more troops in the bars in Saigon than John Kennedy admitted were in the entire country when I was in the Pentagon. So there's a long history to that. But I think it clearly was Lyndon Johnson's decision, and I think he'd be the first one to say that he made that decision.
Thank you. Would anyone else on the panel care to comment on that? All right, let's go to the next question.
I have an additional question for Mr. Califano on his membership in the Council on Foreign Relations.
No, come on.
This picture here shows all the different cabinet officials of the Johnson administration being CFR members.
What is your question, please?
Okay, it's very simple. Once you become a cabinet officer, you swear to uphold the U.S. Constitution, preserve and protect and defend it. But I have this quote from a former CFR member, Admiral Chester War, stated that the Council is seeking submergence of U.S. sovereignty and national independence into an all-powerful one-world government. And in fact, your founder once wrote he wanted social...
What is the question?
How can you be under oath to U.S. Constitution and be a member of this organization which wants to submerge the United States into a one-world government which would be above the Constitution?
Let's get the next question.
I think that question is, let's classify as rhetorical and go on to the next question. Nelson?
I'd like to ask a non-CFR question. As a student at the Kennedy School, we're looking with a lot of interest, obviously, at the next election. And to the three of you that have served very close to the president, I was wondering if there's any lessons that maybe you can point out, or any advice, if you would, as far as to the next candidate, let's say the next Democratic candidate, assuming he was maybe at two stages. One, as he's planning after the nomination, as he's trying to gear that message to the American public, and then assuming, and obviously it's a big assumption, that he got into the White House. What kind of advice as far as policy building could you lay out?
The one thing I would say to a Democrat is win. For God's sakes, win this time. I would note, and I'd say, I think the overriding problem that president faces is the economy. I would note, I don't think I mentioned it here, I may have mentioned it at dinner earlier, Lyndon Johnson spent more time on the economy than any other subject. It was critical to his presidency. You couldn't have the Great Society if you didn't have a booming economy. And I'd ask you to reflect on a couple of things. One, real wages went up about every week of the Johnson presidency, even though this money was put into the Great Society and the war, and even though we had Two, we did pay for the war. The 10% tax surcharge we asked for in January of '67, which was passed in June of '68, the last budget surplus in the United States was Lyndon Johnson's last year in office. The last surplus in the balance of payments, thanks to programs that Francis worked on and Lyndon Johnson rammed through Congress, was in Lyndon Johnson's last year in office. So I think our next president has got to make the economy run. One last thing. You look at the terrific increase in racial strife and tension. We didn't have a problem with affirmative action in 1960. He articulated at Howard University in 1965, and then we developed the policies. With unemployment below 4% during all of, almost all of '65, '6, '7, and '8, people were reaching out to employ every able-bodied person they could employ. So when we went to American Business in 1968 and said, we want you to hire 200,000 people in the next year out of city ghettos, basically, and we're going to establish numbers of people that you should hire. You've got to go in and get these guys and gals. You've got to scrub them. You've got to teach them to read. You've got to teach them to write. You've got to put them in jobs that never had anything to get up for. They've never gotten up for a job before. Business went out and did it. And we had no white resentment because nobody was losing a job. If the economy doesn't work, the country doesn't work. And the bad economy, in an almost ironic way, worries me as a problem for the Democratic Party, as well as obviously an issue, because it certainly heightens the racial tension issue in this country. And we are very much a party identified with the cause of minority America. So I think the president's got to work on the economy.
Francis had...
I won't say what... I mean, I've had my say about what presidents ought to do about the economy last week.
And it was very good.
And I keep talking about it, so not now. But I do want to say something that hasn't really come up, that has to do with Lyndon Johnson's perception that the principal source of pressure on him, on Vietnam, came from the right and not the left. I remember when the question was, all his advisors said to him, you've got to go for it, tax increase in 1965. And I remember the president saying, you deliver Wilbur Mills. You show me where the votes are on the Ways and Means Committee. I'll become the biggest tax raiser in town. Joe Fowler, the Secretary of the Treasury, sent in a memo. It came through me. I put a note on it. Sent in a memo. Mr. President, all you have to do is run up the flag, say you're commander-in-chief, and we're at war, and by God, you'll get that tax increase. The president in my hearing said, I'm not going to do that. You know what would happen if I did that? First of all, the Great Society would go down the drain. I would lose my leverage on the Hill. I'd get that tax increase through, but I'd lose my leverage on the Hill. Secondly, everything with stars in this town would be in my office the next day and said, okay, Mr. President, you're commander-in-chief. If it's war, by God, do an inch-on, mine the harbor, bomb the hell out of Hanoi, invade Cambodia. He said, you must remember that that's where, I'll tell you another story, when I left, my last meeting, next to last meeting, but last meeting before I resigned, in his office, in the Oval Office, and sort of I went in and gave me my photograph album. He selected every picture in the photograph album and my White House cufflinks, and we were sort of standing there. And he said, well, Francis, and I'm grateful to you that you've been of enormous help to your president and the country, and you've been loyal to me. I know you're a dove, and you think this Vietnam stuff is awful, but, you'll go up to Cambridge, and I'll give you 2 months. I can't do it in Texan. Comes out in Hungarian. I'm sorry. He said, I'll give you 2 months, and you join those friends of yours. He said, Galbraith and Schlesinger and Goodman. Goodman. He said, you will start writing letters to the New York Times calling me a fascist beast. And I said, no, Mr. President, we can do that, whatever. And started pulling polls out of his pocket and saying, well, you just remember when you are tempted. He said, you doves, you think you have a lot of leverage in this country. You're dead wrong. He said, you remember, he said, I'm the little Dutch boy here holding my finger in the dike, protecting you, doves, from the crazies. And as he was saying this, and I have a picture, because the court photographer, Okamoto, was right there and took a picture. He walked around his desk, and I have a picture. I was standing there in front of the desk with this album and looking sheepish, and there was the President of the United States on the other side of the desk, ears like this, features like this. And he pulled up a green silk sash, said, all the way with Kurt LeMay on the sash in gold letters, and said, well, you remember when you write those letters and whatever. So, point one. I don't think he knew until after Tet.
Nelson, I might add just one other thing that comes from Joe's book that maybe somebody looking at this year's campaign ought to think about seriously. He quotes Johnson as having said to Moyers in 1964, after the first big Civil Rights Act that he signed, we probably have turned the South over to the Republicans for your lifetime and mine. And maybe the Democrats ought to look in the Midwest and the West in 1992.
I'd just like to add from Joe's book also, when you read about the 60s and you read about Johnson through that book, what you see is the sense that problems can be solved, the belief that these problems are man-made and men can solve them because men have created them. And I think what the Democrats have to remember is that spirit. It's not just a party spirit, it's what we who lived during that decade believed. There was this incredible sense of possibility, a belief in government, a belief that we could do things for the community, and a sense of being larger than individuals because we had that collective sense of moving forward. We've lost that belief in the last couple decades. I mean, it's been a time of much more individual, self-seeking opportunity, and the Democrats themselves have lost their confidence because government's been under such a poor run, even the confidence that problems can be solved. And I think what you need from a Democrat is a confident voice that can say this country can be turned around. This economy doesn't have to be going inexorably out of control in a way that we have nothing to do about it. What they have to recapture is some of the mood that the people who were living and alive and breathing in the 1960s had every day as a part of their living life.
Bob? Thank you. We started, I think, with a clip on the speech on the Voting Rights Act. And Secretary Califano, you talked about thousands of black elected officials and the rise of the black middle class. But here it is a quarter of a century later, and we have David Duke. Not only David Duke, but semi-responsible people in California saying all the problems there are caused by immigrants and quite a nasty racial atmosphere, I think, around the country, not just from David Duke. What would Lyndon Johnson think of the situation now, and how would he respond?
Well, let me try. I mean, I think he'd be dealing with it in an entirely different way than we're now dealing with it from everything he's done. But let me say something more generally. If only in 1970 Richard Nixon had not gone on television and made a massive issue of busing in a very racially charged way, if only Ronald Reagan had not and George Bush had not gotten into all these subliminal racial issues, I think the country would be so much better off on this issue. I mean, if a couple of Republican presidents would say, look, this is our national policy, we're dealing with this problem. We're going to treat people equally. We're going to treat them fairly. You know, for 50 years, we had an array of presidents. Whatever you say about Korea, about Vietnam, about Ronald Reagan's buildup, about Kennedy almost blowing this country up with nuclear war over Cuba and Khrushchev, about Eisenhower and Lebanon, the one thing that everybody in the world, the communist world, had to say was, Jesus Christ, these guys, for 50 years, they'll spill their blood, they'll spend their fortune, they're going to be free, and we're not going to win this thing. If we could get that kind of a consistent policy on race, I think we'd make a change. It is the toughest issue I've ever seen. When I was at HEW, I had no problem with women's rights. I had no problem with when we'd move on Hispanics, when we'd move on the disabled. But every time we touched the racial button, we got resistance, and it's astonishing. It is really a problem in America, and I think one of the most irresponsible things that George Bush and Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon have done is keep that issue boiling. They can put it to bed in a way that the Democratic Party can't put it to bed.
Francis?
Yeah, and the way I think Lyndon Johnson might have been able to put it away during 69, 72. What I find the most troubling thing to me about the Johnson history is not that we went headfirst into the muck in 65, but that during the 1968 campaign, he didn't make it a lot easier on Hubert Humphrey to separate himself from Johnson's Vietnam policy. And by God, that election came extraordinarily close. One of the things that Johnson kept saying, you know, a lot of the economists fussed at him. I don't know whether Joe did. He must have heard this about trying to do too many things, and it's going to be inefficient and messy. And I remember hearing him once. He said, listen, all this efficiency stuff is a lot of nonsense. We won World War II in a very inefficient way, and what we have to do is throw legislation and throw money after these problems, and we'll start learning about what works and what doesn't work. And once I see what doesn't, I will slowly start sort of chipping away at the stuff that doesn't, pushing the stuff that does work. The great tragedy, of course, is that even before 68, Vietnam increasingly absorbed him, and he was unable to do that. But if you want to blame him for something, blame him for what happened, because that's how we got Nixon. And one more story, and then I'll stop. It's particularly ironic for me, given that he helped elect Richard Nixon, I'm afraid, is that on the Tuesday after the Sunday, March 31 withdrawal speech, I'd left the White House in 67, and I'd back twice to pulled me back. But I was sitting in my study watching him on the tube on Sunday evening make the resignation statement. And when it was over, I reached for the telephone. I called Tom Johnson. And I said, Tom, I've got to be in Washington on Tuesday. I'm coming down Monday night, staying at the Hay Adams. I'd love to just, I know the boss is busy, but I want to go in and salute and shake his hand. I got down there, message come Tuesday noon. I thought I'd be in there for 3 minutes. I was in there an hour, 15 minutes monologue. Part of the monologue was about the vice presidency and how awful Robert Kennedy had been. Jack had been nice to him. Jacqueline had been nice to him, but Bob, he said, humiliated me every moment. And then he turned and said, you know, the most terrible job in the world. You know why I ran for that terrible job? Why I took up Jack's offer? He said, Lady Bird told me not to do it. The Speaker told me not to do it. Dick Russell told me to do it. You know why I was willing to leave what was the second most important job in the United States as Majority Leader of the United States Senate and take that terrible nothing job? He said, because I didn't think that Jack could hack it on his own, and I wasn't going to be responsible for helping to make Richard Nixon President of the United States.
Let me just go back on your question. Johnson did despise Richard Nixon. There's no question about that. I might make two other points very quickly. One, Lyndon Johnson talked about the disintegration of the black family. Nobody listened to us. We tried to get the so-called man-in-the-house rule changed and the welfare program, which the husband had to leave in order for the kids to get help. And he spoke 2 or 3 times quite eloquently about that. And indeed, once at length about the responsibility that white America bore for that, from slavery and continuing. He would have moved, he would have tried harder, I think, to move on the whole black family issue. Secondly, even he was very conscious, I understand what Doris meant, and we both on the love issue and not being appreciated, but he was very conscious and understood that blacks would be impatient. I mean, he knew that he was saying to what the oppressed once accepted as inevitable would become intolerable once he gave them a little light. And when he had a riot in Watts, to give you a difference and think about how a Reagan or a Bush would have handled Watts, at the riot in Watts, one of his greatest concerns was that the people he was trying to help would destroy their chance for him to help them. And it's also the right-wing problem of the day. He had me call Pat Brown and have a commission set up in California. One, because people were going to say it was communists and the blacks, to get John McCone, the member of the Council on Foreign Relations, John McCone, who had been the CIA director, but clearly conservative, to chair the commission because he knew there'd be a finding that there wasn't communist involvement, nobody could quarrel with it. That would open the way for him to move a lot of programs into Watts. And secondly, about 5 days before we moved the programs into Watts, we engineered a speaking occasion which he could equate the Ku Klux Klan with the black rioters, so that he had a calculated prelude for what he did. I think those kinds of things he'd be doing. He'd be working on the problem. I don't think these people are working on that problem.
Mr. Healy, I think you had a piece about this. Was there on October 11th in 1963, shortly before Jack Kennedy was killed, an action memorandum beginning a process of withdrawal of troops from Vietnam? I believe it was number 263 or something. And was that superseded shortly after Johnson assumed the presidency? And would any members of the panel wish to comment on, was it true that Kennedy was in fact beginning a process of withdrawal, and was that course changed when Johnson, and why, when he came into the presidency, and why?
Who do you want to ask?
Well,
anyone who wants to comment.
Initially was addressed to Bob, but anybody.
I don't think there was any order. My notion of the thing was that, and I had on a couple of occasions to talk to Kennedy on the subject, was that he wasn't going to pull out of Vietnam before the election of 1964 because he knew he was going to run against Barry Goldwater, or he felt in 1963 that he'd be running against Barry Goldwater, and he'd get hammered if he pulled out. So I don't think there was anything official, and Francis would know better than I about that. But my
didn't you write a piece where you specifically referred to something like that? And when shortly after Bush was elected, the 25th anniversary, around that time, didn't you have an op-ed piece in the Globe where you referred to?
Where I raised that question? No, I have written several times that I thought that Kennedy would follow the course of Laos, because when when Kennedy came to the presidency in 1961, Laos was on the front burner, people like Rostow were deeply involved in the subject, and it was a much harder issue than was Vietnam, and they worked out a pattern of solution there. And
Ike told JFK, apparently, on his thing that the most important thing for the country was Laos and whatever. I mean, it really shook JFK.
You don't hear that now at all, but the fact was that this was the burning issue, not Vietnam.
We're getting very close to our normal closing time. One last question.
For Secretary Califano, something anecdotal perhaps to end. The nature of the relationship between Johnson and Hubert Humphrey, where Johnson was such an extraordinary...
Johnson thought Humphrey was weak. I'll give you one anecdote, all right, and then we'll close the night down. Walter Reuther came in one day to see Johnson and to the United Oil Workers leader, and he said, if you don't rebuild the cities of this country, we're going to burn them down, pour billions in. And I had lunch with the president the next day, and the president was talking about Humphrey. He was about to take away all of Humphrey's civil rights responsibilities. And he said, the difference between Hubert and me, he said, when Walter Reuther comes into the Oval Office and he's got that limp hand in his pocket, Reuther had a limp right arm from an assassin's bullet, and he's telling Humphrey that if he doesn't put billions into the cities, he's going to burn them down. Hubert's will be sitting there smiling, thinking, listening all the time, but thinking, how can I get his hand out of his pocket so I can shake it? He said, when Walter Reuther comes in and tells me that, I sit in the rocker and I'm smiling and I'm thinking all the time, how can I get his hand out of his pocket so I can cut his balls off? And that is the difference between them.
That's a conclusion to an evening with Lyndon Johnson.